Stop there, driver. Throw down your gun.
All right, driver, take it away. Yeah! Get on!
I'm John Bosnecker, and my friends Dylan and Alan asked me to do a short interview about my new book, which is about Black Bart, the stage robber. And I have it right here. Just came in the mail about 10 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago. And the book is titled Gentleman Bandit, The True Story of Black Bart, the Old West's Most Infamous Stagecoach Robber. There was actually a movie about Black Bart done back in the 1940s with Yvonne DiCarlo was the woman heroine, and the movie, like most Westerns, had absolutely nothing to do with reality. But the real Black Bart story requires no embellishment. He held up and robbed 28 stagecoaches in California in the 1870s and early 1880s, and had really a kind of a fascinating career as a gentleman bandit. So he was born in England in 1829, brought to New York State when he was only a year old, when his parents and other people in the village he lived in up in Norfolk, up in northeastern England near the city of Norwich, decided to come to the United States for a better life, like so many people did back in that era. And they came by sailing ship across the Atlantic to New York, took the Erie Canal to upstate New York. They settled on a farm not that far from Waterford in upstate New York. And there, Charlie Boles, his real name was Charles Boles. If you go online, you'll see people call him Charles Earl Boles. No evidence of that. That's what I call an internet invention. I probably shouldn't get too far off topic here, but since the advent of the internet in about 1998, 1999, there's no editing, anybody can publish anything. And so if you go on Wikipedia, when you read about the Old West, the topic that I know about, I'd guess that 60 to 70% of the information on Wikipedia is wrong, fictional, fantasy, whatever. So there's a lot of false information about Black Bart that appears online. My book is researched entirely from primary sources and tells the real story, just like all my books do. They're truthful books, exhaustively researched from contemporary sources, newspapers, court records, diaries, letters, that kind of thing. I should mention, and I pointed this out in my various books, I've written books about a number of outlaws: Tiburcio Vasquez, the famous Latino bandito of old California, Bill Miner, the Gray Fox. Many people have seen that film, The Gray Fox. And the problem with writing about outlaws is they didn't leave diaries. They, for the most part, did not leave correspondence. They didn't leave a record of their lives. So you have to go back and try to recreate from court records, newspaper accounts, memoirs, reminiscences. And that's the case with Black Bart. A handful of his letters have survived. He wrote them, I'm getting ahead of the story, he wrote them in the middle of his life. But Black Bart, again, true name Charles Boles, ended up coming out to California from New York in the California Gold Rush in 1850. He wanted to hit it rich, just like all the other 49ers. He didn't make a fortune. He returned to the Midwest. He had a brother living in Iowa at the time, an older brother. Spent time with him, returned to New York, very bored, didn't like farm work. He didn't like digging ditches and milking cows. And, if he had done that for 40 years, he probably would have ended up as a wealthy farmer, but he wasn't willing to do that. So he goes to California again in 1852. He takes a ship down to the Isthmus of Panama, crosses the isthmus with one of his cousins and one of his brothers. Both of them come down with malaria from the mosquitoes, and this, of course, is in many, many years before any kind of antidote for malaria was ever developed. And both of them, on the arrival in San Francisco, they died very quickly within a few weeks of arriving back in California. And again, he travels all over the mining country, the southern mines down around Sonora, Tuolumne County, which is the same county Yosemite is located in. And from there, he mined all the way up to the Oregon border, Shasta, Weaverville, and he basically hits every mining town in Northern California, which is something that would become important to him in his later career as a stage robber. So Bart, or Charlie, as I call him in the book, again doesn't hit it rich. And he ends up going back to New York State. Eventually he meets a woman in Iowa when he's out visiting his brother. They get married. They end up having 3 daughters and a son who dies as very early at the age of about 4 or 5. The child mortality rates back in that era were very, very high. But Charlie Boles then gets a small farm in northern Iowa near the state line. And he farms for a number of years. And then in 1861, the Civil War breaks out. And at this point, he's given up his farm in Iowa, moved to another farm in Macon County, Illinois, just north of Decatur. And he's well liked. He's very athletic, outgoing, very gentlemanly. He doesn't swear, he doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, very unusual for most men in that era. And he, thinks about enlisting in 1861, but he doesn't do it. Everybody thinks the war is going to be over in, a few months, and then the horrible battles occur, and it becomes evident after 6 months that this war is going to be a long and bloody one. So the following year, 1862, President Lincoln issues a call for hundreds of thousands of volunteers. And at this point, Charlie Boles, he doesn't like married life. It's evident that he may have simply married out of convenience. He wants freedom, he wants adventure, so he joins the Illinois Volunteers in Macon County and ends up very quickly in extensive combat in the southern, or kind of what they call the western theater of the war, and he fights all the way over to Georgia, ends up in the Sherman's March to the Sea in 1865. He's wounded 2 times. He claims 3. The military records show 2. And during the war, he learns, number one, to gamble. He becomes very well known as a gambler, very successful, playing cards with his fellow soldiers. And he also learns to steal, because in Sherman's March to Georgia, Sherman is authorized by the War Department to forage, meaning that the army will travel as they go. They will steal and pillage and burn their entire way to the sea. And so at the end of the war, Charlie Boles is, mustered out of the Army, goes back to Illinois, and again, he's got this restless aspect to his personality. He soon, by 1867, he later claims that he and his wife had an agreement that he would go join the gold rush to Montana. Several of his comrades from his unit, the 116th Illinois Volunteers, say no, he and his wife had a big fight and he left her, which seems far more accurate. So he goes to Montana. He's in the area around Butte. He has a mining claim. Again, he's not successful. His family in later years claims that Wells Fargo owned a mine, and they cheated him out of his mine, and they turned off his water supply, etc. And this is all just a cockamamie oral history. Wells Fargo and Company was an express company. They didn't own a mine anywhere in the American West. And this is just a family myth and an explanation of his later career, which is simply not true. So Boles finally, he communicates with his wife for a couple years. Suddenly, he just stops writing. She never hears of him again for 16 years. And he ends up in San Francisco in about 1873. And he suddenly becomes a gentleman of leisure. He stays in these very nice boarding houses and hotels. He dressed in the height of fashion, wearing a derby hat, a gold cane, a gold watch, a salt and pepper three-piece suit, shiny shoes, a far cry from the farm in Iowa and a far cry from the muddy ditches that he lived in during the Civil War as an infantryman. And after a year or so, it becomes evident the source of his newfound wealth is that every few months he would put on his ragged old clothes, he'd unbreech his double-barrel shotgun, put it into his blanket roll, and he would walk, often 200-300 miles on foot, and hold up a stagecoach in a remote area of Northern California. And then a week or so later, he'd walk back, hop a ferry in Oakland, come across the bay to the ferry building, which is still there in San Francisco, and he'd walk up Market Street to his rooming house and resume his secret life as a gentleman in San Francisco. And this went on for 8 years. And after one robbery up on the Mendocino coast, he left a bit of poetry. And he wrote this on the back of a Wells Fargo waybill, which is like a receipt or a register of the packages. And he flipped it over and wrote on the back, he wrote this little poem. I labored long and hard for bread, for honor and for riches, but on my corns too long you've tread, you fine-haired sons of bitches. And this was clearly a reference to the fact that everybody's mean to me, I can't earn a good living, so I'm gonna steal. It's something that he learned serving under General Sherman. And not every man, I mean, there were hundreds of thousands of Union soldiers, and none of them ever robbed 33 stagecoaches. So what he does is he then signs the poetry Black Bart. And Black Bart was the name of a villain in a very popular short story of the era. And ever after, he's known as Black Bart. And pretty soon, every lawman in Northern California is hunting for him. And they just cannot catch him. He just disappears. So a common myth about Black Bart is the reason he would walk was because he was afraid of horses. And again, this is just a made-up story. It actually predates the internet, so I can't blame the internet on this story. But the fact is that the reason he walked, in that era, people knew horse flesh, and it's very common to see like a wanted notice, and the person who gives the information would give a better description of the horse than of the rider, because everybody knew horse flesh. And Charlie Boles knew that. And so he would walk, number one, so he's not on a horse. People paid less attention to a pedestrian than a horseman. And number two, he didn't have to follow wagon roads and stagecoach routes. He would walk cross country and making it almost impossible for anybody to track him. And this is what he did for 8 years. He robbed 29 stagecoaches with almost clock-like regularity. He never made a big killing in any of these robberies. He usually get $200, $300, $400, $500. Every once in a while, he might get $1,000, which is a lot of money back then when you consider that a working man made about $30 a month. A police officer made maybe $70 a month. That was considered excellent pay in the 1870s and 80s. So finally, after all these robberies and one holdup, he gets shot. The Wells Fargo shotgun messenger creases his scalp with a buckshot. He has a bunch of other close calls. Another time he hides in an old stump and he finds out that his neighbor is a skunk and he has to sit in the log with a skunk while the posse is walking all around, and he finally managed to get out gasping for air after the posse men had left and never did find him. So he had one adventure after another for 8 years. And finally, he robs a stagecoach on a place called Funk Hill. And I've got some great photos of the robbery location in my book. And the short version is that a young boy named Jimmy Rolleri, whose mother owned a tavern down at the bottom of this Funk Hill, which is actually a mountain, not a hill, and Rolleri got off the stagecoach to hunt deer, and he came back to the coach, which went around the side of Funk Hill, and saw the robbery happen. And using the rifle, he and the stage robber opened fire on Black Bart. Bart had ordered the stage on and went around the corner when Jimmy Rolleri came up the road and found out about the holdup. So they fired on Black Bart. They nicked him with a bullet. Black Bart fled and left behind his derby hat and a handkerchief. And this was what I call in the book the telltale handkerchief, because it eventually ends up in the hands of Harry Morse, the most famous lawman on the Pacific coast of the 19th century. He has his own private detective agency in San Francisco, and he's been hired by Wells Fargo to try to catch Black Bart. And Morse realizes that this handcuff is probably from a large city like Stockton, Sacramento, San Francisco. He starts in San Francisco. He visits about 80 laundries. He finally finds the one that leads him to Black Bart. He's talking to the laundry owner on Bush Street, about 200 feet uphill from Montgomery still. Anybody can walk there today. It's not marked. It should be. And while Morse is in front of the tobacco shop that acts as the laundry agency, the owner is telling him, oh yes, that belongs to Mr. Bolton, which is the alias Charlie Boles is using. He's calling himself Charles Bolton in San Francisco. And then the laundry guy says, well, here comes Mr. Bolton now. And Morse looks, and sure enough, there's this natty guy with a gold cane and a derby hat, jauntily walking up the sidewalk. And that's the beginning of the end for Black Bart. He basically pleads guilty to the final stage robbery, number 29. It's a plea deal, leads Wells Fargo detectives to the stolen gold, about $6,000 worth. Wells Fargo has a lot of influence back then. The judge gives him 8 years in prison. Normally, he would have gotten 8 years for all those robberies. And so Bart spends about 6 years in San Quentin, gets, good behavior, gets out in 1888, and he doesn't reform at all. He robs 3 more stagecoaches, and then he vanishes for good. And what happened to him, nobody knows. There's these kooky stories. He ended up in Australia. He ended up in Japan. He ended up in China. None of those stories are true. I explain in my book why they're not true. The most reliable accounts are that he went down either to New Mexico or Old Mexico and had a cattle ranch and basically lived down there quietly. But even then, there's no proof of that. And so the fate of Black Bart remains one of the great mysteries of the Old West. And so this is the book, Gentleman Bandit. It's got, I think, about 70 photographs in there, many of them never published before. I've got photographs of some of the Civil War guys that he served with. His wife's home in Hannibal, Missouri, which I was fortunate to visit just this last October. Have a photograph I took of it. His wife and his daughters lived in Hannibal for many, many years. Hannibal is one of the greatest towns I've ever visited. Between Black Bart, the Mississippi River, and Mark Twain, you can't go wrong if you want to visit Hannibal. And the book, it's about 360 something pages long, and it's not the first book about Black Bart, but it's the most in-depth book. Several other writers who I owe a big debt to have written books about Black Bart back in the early 90s, and I've managed to combine all that research with a lot of my own research and come up with a new and comprehensive biography of the Old West greatest stage robber.